Sometimes the most powerful stories are the quiet ones, the kind you don't read in history books, but remember in your heart. Tonight, we'll step into the life of a grandmother whose steady courage and unspoken promises shaped the fate of her family. So, settle in, let the world slow down for a while, and come with me into her story. How a strong grandmother sacrificed herself to save her family from deadly danger. It was one of those nights when the wind has a mind of its own, sharp, restless, circling through the pines like a warning whispered from the dark. Out beyond the ridge, where the land meets the railroad tracks, a single whistle cut through the air. It wasn't the warm, familiar sound of a train rolling home. This one was different, long, mournful, almost pleading. I remember standing at the kitchen sink, my hands resting in the lukewarm dishwater, staring out the small square window above it. The night was a heavy quilt of black, stitched with only a few weak stars. Somewhere, far off, a dog barked and then stopped, as if it, too, had decided silence was safer. My old wall clock ticked steadily behind me, but I could feel something else. Something pressing in from the outside, as if the air itself was holding its breath. Most folks around here will tell you they can smell trouble before it arrives. They'll talk about the way the sky changes or how the birds fall quiet. That night, I could smell it too, not in the air exactly, but in my bones. It was the sort of stillness that doesn't come from peace. It comes from waiting. I dried my hands on the faded dish towel, the one with the fraying edge my granddaughter used to tug on when she was barely tall enough to reach my knee. I thought about her then, about all of them, scattered miles away. The last time they'd been here, we'd sat out on the porch eating apple pie, and I'd caught myself memorizing their faces in the late light. I didn't know why. Sometimes your heart knows before your head does. The wind pushed against the old wooden siding, making it creak in the way an old body creaks in the cold. I moved through the house on habit, checking the latch on the back door, the lock on the cellar. The floorboards groaned under my slippers, the same sound I'd heard every night for decades, but that night, it felt louder, like the house itself was uneasy. When I reached the front door, I paused. The street lamp across the dirt road flickered, throwing shadows that danced and stilled, like they couldn't make up their mind whether to stay or flee. I thought about opening the door, stepping out onto the porch, breathing in the night to prove to myself that it was nothing, that I was just being an old woman with too many memories. But I didn't. I stayed right there, my hand on the brass doorknob, listening. That's when I heard it. A sound low and distant, not quite human, not quite the wind. It came in waves, like something struggling to reach me, then pulling back again. My heart thudded in my chest, but not from fear exactly. No, this was something else. Recognition, maybe. As if I'd heard that same sound in another lifetime, in another kind of trouble. I stepped away from the door and went back into the kitchen. The kettle was still warm from the tea I'd made earlier, so I poured what was left into my cup, the steam curling upward, carrying the faint smell of chamomile. I wrapped both hands around the cup, letting the warmth seep into my fingers. I should have turned on the radio, let some music fill the empty space, but I didn't. I just sat there at the table, staring at the wood grain, worn smooth by years of elbows and coffee cups, and let the quiet stretch long. Because I knew, deep down in the same place I keep the names of the dead, that something was on its way. And in that moment, I thought of my grandmother, who once told me, "Child, when the wind won't rest, neither should you." I hadn't understood her then, but that night I understood. I could feel it. The night wasn't just passing. It was gathering itself, pulling me toward a moment I didn't yet see, but somehow already feared. I took a slow sip of tea and looked toward the hallway, toward the shelf where an old black-and-white photograph sat in its tarnished silver frame. My husband, gone these 30 years, was smiling in that half-serious way he had, the kind of smile that made you feel safe without promising you the world. I whispered his name before I even realized I was doing it. Outside, the wind changed direction, pushing against the house with a steady, deliberate force. The whistle came again, closer this time, and with it a feeling in my chest, part ache, part warning. I set down my cup. That was the night it began. Most mornings in my life now start the same way. The rooster across the road is my alarm clock, though I've never once owned a rooster myself. His crowing drifts through the half-open bedroom window, mixing with the faint hum of the highway 3 miles away. By the time I pull myself out of bed, the sun is spilling over the tops of the pines, painting the kitchen in that thin gold light that makes even the dust motes look graceful. I'm 78 years old, and this house, my house, is both my anchor and my echo chamber. It's where every birthday cake was baked, every argument was had, and every lullaby was sung. The walls are papered with a faded rose pattern from the 1960s, patched in places where my husband's hands once tried to fix what was peeling. The floors, worn smooth, creak in all the right spots, so I know exactly where I am in the dark. My days are predictable in a way that only old age can make them. Mornings start with oatmeal, a spoonful of honey, and the newspaper spread out beside my coffee cup. I still read every headline, even though the news feels heavier now, like carrying a bucket you can't set down. After breakfast, I make the rounds, watering the spider plants on the porch, checking the mailbox even when I know there's nothing inside but catalogs and bills. The mailbox is an old metal thing, painted red once upon a time, though most of that paint has surrendered to rust. My husband bought it at a hardware store closing sale for $2, saying it had character. Every time I run my hand over its dented side, I can almost hear his laugh again. I keep the radio on low most of the day, tuned to the same AM station that plays country songs from the 50s and 60s. The DJ's voice is as familiar to me as the hum of my refrigerator. Sometimes a certain song will come on, a Hank Williams tune or Patsy Cline, and I'll have to stop whatever I'm doing, just to let it wash over me. Those songs are stitched to my life like the seams in my old quilts. But even with all this routine, there's a quiet weight that never quite leaves me. It's in the way I catch myself staring out the kitchen window too long, or how I linger over photographs in the hallway. The photographs tell a story I can't say out loud without my voice cracking. My son's graduation, my granddaughter's first birthday, a Christmas morning where everyone was laughing so hard we forgot to open the last of the presents. When the phone rings these days, it's almost always a robocall or the neighbor asking if I need anything from town. My family calls when they can, but I know how life pulls people in different directions. They're hours away, caught up in work, school, and the business of living. I tell them I'm fine, and in many ways I am. But there's an ache under the surface. Not loneliness exactly, but something close. I've never been afraid of being alone. Solitude has been a companion to me for years, but there's a difference between solitude you choose and the kind that chooses you. In the evenings, after the dishes are washed and the doors are locked, I'll sit in my armchair by the window, knitting something I'll probably never wear. My hands move by memory, but my mind wanders, to birthdays I missed, to moments I wish I'd held on to a little longer. Some nights, I'll walk out onto the porch just to feel the air on my face. I'll listen to the crickets and the far-off sound of a train, and for a moment, it feels like the years fold in on themselves. I'm 20 again, waiting for my husband to come home from a long shift. Or I'm 35, standing barefoot with my son in my arms, watching fireflies blink in the yard. There are reminders of the past tucked into every corner of this place. The chipped mug my husband drank his coffee from every morning, the old coat hanging by the door that still smells faintly of cedar, the quilt my mother pieced together from scraps of our childhood clothes. I tell myself these things keep me connected. But some days, they feel like anchors that won't let me drift too far from the shore of what used to be. The truth is, there's a story under all of this. The routines, the quiet, the careful tending of the house. A story I've kept mostly to myself, because saying it out loud feels like letting a flood through a crack in the dam. It's the story of what happened to my family, the choices that scattered us, and the piece of my heart that's been missing ever since. And lately, maybe because of the letter I just received, or maybe because of that strange night with the wind and the whistle, I can feel that story stirring again, like something that's been asleep too long. It's there in the stillness, waiting for me to speak it, and I know deep down that speaking it will change everything. My family's story is stitched together from equal parts laughter and loss, the way most American families are. I had only one child, my son, Daniel. He was the kind of boy who came into the world with wide eyes, as if he wanted to memorize everything before it could slip away. His father used to say, "That boy's got an old soul." And I suppose he was right. Daniel grew up in this house, running barefoot through the yard, climbing the apple tree out back until I had to call him down for supper. He was never one to sit still, but he had a quiet kindness in him. Even as a teenager, he'd hold the door for his grandmother or offer to mow Mrs. Turner's lawn next door without being asked. When he met his wife, Claire, I knew she was the one for him before he did. She had this steady way about her, calm in a storm, gentle but never fragile. Together, they built a life not far from here, in a small town where everyone knew their names. They gave me 2 granddaughters, Lily and Emma, who filled my days with the kind of joy you don't realize you've been missing until it's there, laughing and tumbling into your arms. Some of my favorite memories are from those years when the house was rarely quiet. Saturday mornings with pancakes on the griddle, Lily's high-pitched giggles echoing down the hall, Emma curled up on the couch with a book far too big for her age. I'd babysit whenever they asked, and even when they didn't. I knew every favorite snack, every bedtime story they loved best. It felt like the world had given me a second chance to do motherhood all over again, this time without the rush and worry that had filled my own younger years. But life, as it tends to do, has a way of shifting under your feet when you least expect it. The factory where Daniel worked started cutting back shifts. At first it was just a few hours here and there, but soon the layoffs came. Claire took on extra hours at the clinic, but it still wasn't enough to keep the bills paid. I could see the weight settling on Daniel's shoulders, in the way his smile thinned and his eyes grew tired. We tried to help where we could. I baked more casseroles, slipped a little cash into his coat pocket when he wasn't looking. We had long talks at this very kitchen table where I told him we'd figure it out together. He'd nod, but I could tell he was already looking for a solution beyond what I could give. Then came the winter when everything seemed to unravel. A storm iced over the roads, and the clinic closed for a week. The girls caught the flu, and the medical bills piled up faster than they could be paid. I remember standing in their driveway one evening, watching Daniel load boxes into the back of his truck. "We've got a chance in Cedar Falls," he said, his breath clouding in the cold. "Construction job for me. Better hours for Claire. It's what's best for now." Best for now felt like a polite way of saying, "We have to leave." They promised it would only be for a while, just until they got back on their feet. I tried to be strong for the girls, hugging them tight and telling them Grandma's house would be waiting when they came back. But when the taillights disappeared down the road, the silence that followed felt heavier than any snowdrift. At first they called every few days, sent pictures of their new apartment and the little park down the street. But as months passed, the calls grew shorter, then less frequent. Life pulled them along, and I stayed here, keeping the house warm, the garden tended, and their rooms just as they'd left them. The ache of their absence was a quiet one, steady, constant, like a low hum you can't turn off. I told myself they were happy. That distance didn't mean the love was gone. But sometimes, late at night, I'd open the old cedar chest at the foot of my bed and run my hands over the girls' baby blankets, breathing in faint, lingering scent of the past. That's the thing about family. You carry them with you whether they're across the street or across the country. And though I didn't know it then, the day would come when carrying them in my heart wouldn't be enough. I would have to fight, truly fight, to keep them safe. The first real tear in the fabric of our lives came in the form of a phone call late on a Sunday evening. I remember the way the light from the table lamp spilled across the kitchen, the old clock ticking steadily in the background. I almost didn't answer. It was one of those numbers you don't recognize, the kind that usually tries to sell you something you don't need. But something told me to pick it up. It was Daniel. His voice was calm on the surface, but I could hear the strain underneath, like a rope pulled too tight. "Ma," he said, "we had an accident at the site." My breath caught. He explained that a scaffolding had collapsed while they were working. 2 men had been seriously hurt, one of them a friend of his. He himself had gotten away with just a sprained wrist and a cut above his eyebrow, but the company was shutting down the project for an investigation. No work for at least a month, maybe longer. It wasn't just about the lost wages, though that was bad enough. The accident meant bills they couldn't pay, and rent they might not cover. Claire's hours at the clinic had been cut back too, because a new hire had come in willing to work for less. I could hear in his voice that old familiar weight again, heavier than before. I wanted to tell him to come home, to pack up the girls, and head back to this house where there was always food in the pantry and a bed ready for them. But before I could get the words out, he said, "We'll figure something out, Ma. Don't worry." And just like that, the line went quiet. A week later, another call came, this time from Claire. Her voice was different, clipped and urgent. She told me Daniel's friend from the site had passed away in the hospital. There might be legal trouble for the company, maybe even for the workers if the blame shifted. She didn't say the words out loud, but I could hear it in the way she paused. Fear. Then came the worst part. A letter from someone we didn't know, postmarked from a nearby county, claiming that Daniel owed him money. A large sum. The letter didn't give details, just an ugly warning that debts always come due. My first instinct was to dismiss it as some scam. But when I showed it to a neighbor who knew more about such things, she told me the handwriting looked like the kind used by certain men you didn't want to be involved with. I mailed the letter to Daniel, thinking he'd tell me it was nothing. Instead, when he called, his voice dropped low and he said, "Ma, don't talk to anyone about this. Please. It's better you don't know the details." That's when the pit opened in my stomach. The weeks that followed were a blur of sleepless nights and quiet dread. I'd catch myself looking out the front window longer than usual, scanning for cars I didn't recognize. I kept the porch light on all night. Even the creak of the floorboards upstairs made me tense, though I knew the house was empty except for me. The final blow came on a bitterly cold morning in February. A sheriff's cruiser pulled into my driveway. The man who stepped out wasn't there to deliver bad news in the official sense. No one had been hurt, he said. But he wanted to let me know there'd been some trouble in Cedar Falls involving my son. No charges, but "Keep an eye out, ma'am." That was all he would say before tipping his hat and driving away. I stood in the doorway long after he left, the cold wind biting at my cheeks, my mind racing. It was in that moment I understood. Whatever this was, it wasn't going away on its own. Something had reached into my family's life and set its grip on us. And somehow, I knew it would take more than just patience and prayer to loosen it. Life has a strange way of continuing, even when you feel like you've stepped out of step with the world. After the sheriff's visit, the days rolled on just the same. The sun rose, the rooster crowed, the mail came. But underneath it all, there was a fault line running through my every thought. I tried to keep my routines, if only to keep my hands busy. I'd sweep the porch in the mornings, bake bread on Wednesdays, tend to the little patch of collard greens and onions out back. My neighbors would wave as they drove by, none the wiser to the worry coiled in my chest. Folks in a small town can sense when something's wrong, but they also understand when not to pry. I spoke with Daniel and Claire when I could. The calls were shorter now, clipped at the edges. He'd tell me not to worry. Words meant to comfort, but they only worked when there was something solid behind them. I could hear the strain in his voice, the pauses when he didn't know what to say. Holidays were the hardest. Thanksgiving came and went without the girls underfoot, without the laughter spilling out of the kitchen. I roasted the turkey anyway, setting the table for one but keeping the extra plates in the cupboard, as if they might walk in at any moment. I even made Daniel's favorite sweet potato casserole, the one with the marshmallows browned just enough to be crisp on top. It sat untouched. There were birthdays, too. My granddaughters growing older in photographs sent through the mail. I'd tape them to the refrigerator, studying their faces, trying to read the truth between their smiles. Were they happy? Were they safe? I wanted to ask in every phone call, but I knew I wouldn't get a real answer. Winter turned to spring, and the world outside my window kept its own rhythm. The pear tree bloomed, then shed its blossoms. The river swelled with melted snow, then settled back into its banks. But inside me, nothing settled. The quiet of the house wasn't peaceful anymore. It was too sharp, too loud in its own way. Sometimes at night I'd wake to the sound of a car slowing down on the road out front. Most of the time it would pass on by, but a few times it lingered. I'd sit up in bed, listening to the engine idle, my heart thudding. Eventually, the car would drive off, leaving me with the dark and my own uneasy thoughts. I kept a small notepad by the phone and started jotting down the times Daniel called. What he said, what he didn't say. It made me feel like I was doing something, even if it was only keeping a record. I began saving every letter and envelope, tucking them into a shoebox on the top shelf of my closet. Through it all, I told myself this was just a season, a stretch of bad luck that would pass. But deep down, I knew better. There was a shadow stretching over my family, and it wasn't the kind that moved with the sun. Regret has a way of creeping in when you least expect it. I found myself thinking about the times I'd let pride get in the way, moments when I could have pressed harder, asked more questions, insisted on helping whether they wanted it or not. Maybe if I'd done those things sooner, none of this would have reached us. Still, I held on to hope the way you hold onto the edge of a blanket in a cold night. You clutch it tighter, not looser. I prayed for them every evening, whispering their names into the quiet like a litany. And though I didn't know it yet, those quiet prayers were leading me toward a choice that would demand more of me than anything in my 78 years. It was a Tuesday afternoon in early May when the past came knocking, not with a loud crash, but with the soft scrape of an envelope sliding through the mail slot. I'd just finished hanging the wash on the line, the breeze carrying the scent of fresh soap through the yard. The sun was warm on my back, but there was still a bite of spring in the air. Inside, I bent to pick up the mail, bills, a seed catalog, and then a smaller yellowed envelope with no return address. The handwriting was careful, old-fashioned, the kind you don't see much anymore. I sat down at the kitchen table, the light falling across the worn wood, and slid my finger under the flap. Inside was a single sheet of paper, folded in thirds. The smell hit me first, faint but unmistakable, the scent of old cedar and paper that's been stored away for years. I unfolded it slowly, my eyes catching on the first line. Martha, I'm not sure if you remember me, but I owe your family a debt. The signature at the bottom made my breath hitch. It was from James Callahan, a name I hadn't spoken aloud in decades. James had served alongside my husband during the war, back when they were barely men, but already carrying the weight of it. He'd come to our home once, just after Daniel was born, to thank my husband for something he wouldn't talk about. I'd only ever heard bits and pieces, a night in the mountains, a decision that saved a man's life but cost others dearly. The letter was short, almost hesitant. James wrote that he'd been looking for us for years, that he'd recently learned about the trouble my son was in. He didn't say how he knew, only that he wanted to make good on what was owed before his time ran out. There was a phone number at the bottom, written in a shaky hand. I set the letter down and stared at it, the ticking of the wall clock suddenly loud in the room. The last time I'd thought about James was the day of my husband's funeral, when an unfamiliar bouquet had arrived with no card. I'd always suspected it came from him. The next morning, I found myself up before dawn, the letter still on the table where I'd left it. I made coffee, poured it into my husband's old mug, and sat there with my hand resting on the folded paper. Outside, the mist clung low to the ground, the way it used to on those early mornings when my husband would head out hunting. I didn't call the number right away. Instead, I carried the letter into the living room and dug out the old trunk in the corner. It was full of things I hadn't touched in years. A wool blanket from our first winter together, the telegram from when he shipped home, and at the very bottom, a stack of letters tied with a thin leather cord. My husband's handwriting stared back at me, ink faded, paper soft with age. I untied the cord and began reading. There were stories in those letters I'd never heard, moments of fear and friendship and promises made in the dark. James's name came up more than once. In one letter, my husband had written, "If I don't make it home, promise me you'll tell Martha to help Callahan if he ever needs it. He saved my life." But it was a trade neither of us will ever forget. By the time I put the letters back, the coffee was cold, but my resolve was warm and steady. I picked up the phone and dialed the number from James's letter. It rang twice before a voice answered. Thin, rasping, but unmistakably clear. "Martha?" "Yes," I said, gripping the receiver. "It's me." And just like that, the years between us fell away, replaced by a sense that whatever had been set in motion all those decades ago was now circling back. I didn't know exactly what James could offer or how it might help my son, but I knew one thing for certain. This was no coincidence. Sometimes the past doesn't just visit. It arrives with a purpose. After that phone call with James, something inside me shifted. It was as if the letter had turned a key in a locked room I hadn't entered in years. For so long, I'd kept my memories neatly shelved. My husband's service, the friends he spoke of in half sentences, the parts of his life I was never meant to know in full. But now all those shelves were rattling. James's voice still held the mountain air of our youth, though it was thinned by age. We didn't speak long that first time. He told me he lived upstate now, in a cabin his son had built for him. He'd been sick, something in his lungs, and his doctor didn't give him much time. "I've got to settle my debts, Martha," he said, "especially this one." That night, I couldn't sleep. The wind outside was gentle, brushing against the eaves like a whisper, but my mind was restless. I kept hearing my husband's words from that old letter I'd found. Help Callahan if he ever needs it. Back then, I'd assumed it meant giving him a place to stay or a meal to eat. I never imagined it would mean calling in a debt to save our own. The next morning, I climbed the narrow attic stairs, careful of the weak spot on the third step, and pulled down the cedar chest that held the rest of my husband's keepsakes. There, wrapped in a wool army blanket, was a small, battered wooden box. It was heavier than it looked, and the brass latch was stiff with age. Inside were things I'd forgotten existed. His service medal, a photograph of 3 young men standing in front of a tent, one of them my husband, another clearly James, and a third whose name I didn't know. Beneath that was a folded map, edges frayed, marked with red pencil circles. I traced one with my fingertip, wondering what it had meant to them back then. Holding those things, I felt my husband close to me again. Not in the way grief sometimes sneaks up on you, but in a way that was steady, almost guiding. It was as if he was telling me to pay attention, to follow the thread he'd left behind. That afternoon, I called James again. This time, we talked longer. He told me the map had been part of a mission gone wrong, one that had ended with them stranded in the mountains for 3 days in the dead of winter. Supplies had run out. It was James who found a way down through a narrow pass, carrying my husband when his leg gave out. We never talked about the cost of that decision, he said quietly, but I've carried it every day since. He also told me something else, something that made my pulse quicken. The land marked on that map? It still existed, deep in a rural stretch that most folks had forgotten about. And it wasn't just land. It was valuable, sitting on mineral rights that had never been claimed. I'm the last one left who knows, James said. And I want it to go to your family. I didn't know what to say. It sounded impossible, like something out of a story told on a front porch in the twilight. But there was no tremor in his voice, no hint of invention. That night, I sat at the kitchen table with the map spread out before me. The same table where I'd served birthday cakes and holiday roasts, where my son had done his homework. I studied the red circles until my eyes blurred, trying to imagine the cold they'd faced, the hunger, the fear. I thought about how that one act, James finding the pass, carrying my husband, had led to every moment of my life since. By the time the clock struck midnight, I knew what I had to do. I would go to that place. I would see for myself if what James said was true. And if it was, maybe, just maybe, it was the thread that could pull my family back from the edge. In the quiet of that decision, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. Not peace exactly, but purpose. The morning I set out felt different, as if the air itself was holding its breath. I rose before dawn, the sky still ink-dark over the pines, and packed a small canvas bag with what I thought I might need: a thermos of coffee, a sandwich wrapped in wax paper, my husband's map folded neatly inside a manila envelope, and the old photograph of him and James. I slipped on my sturdy boots, the same pair I wore for years in the garden, and a light jacket, even though the chill outside cut sharper than I expected. Before locking the front door, I paused on the porch. The boards creaked under my weight, the way they always had, but that morning it sounded almost like a send-off. Somewhere down the road, a single car passed, its headlights slicing through the mist before vanishing. I thought of my granddaughters, their hair smelling faintly of shampoo as they leaned in for hugs on those rare visits. That picture in my mind was what I carried with me as I slid behind the wheel of my old sedan. The drive north was long, winding through stretches of farmland where the fields lay flat and open, then climbing into hills that rolled like an old quilt. I kept the radio off. The only sounds were the hum of the tires on asphalt and the occasional rattle from the glove compartment. I wanted the quiet, needed it to keep my thoughts clear. James had given me directions over the phone. You'll see an old white church with no steeple. Turn left there. Follow the gravel road until it narrows to dirt. When you think you're lost, you're close. It was the kind of description that would frustrate most people, but it made sense to me. Places worth finding rarely have clear signs pointing the way. When I finally reached the church, it stood lonely and leaning, its paint peeling in sheets, the windows clouded from years of dust. I turned left as instructed, and soon the tires crunched over gravel, then dipped into the soft give of a dirt track. The trees closed in on either side, tall and close, their branches knitting together overhead until the light dimmed to a greenish glow. Eventually, the road ended in a clearing, and there, sitting on the porch of a weathered log cabin, was James. He rose slowly when he saw me, his frame thinner than I remembered, his hair gone completely white. But his eyes, sharp and steady, were exactly the same as the man in the photograph I'd been carrying. "Martha," he said, his voice warm despite the rasp. "You made it." Inside the cabin, the air smelled faintly of wood smoke and something sweet, maybe the remnants of a pie. He poured coffee into mismatched mugs and spread the map out on the table between us. His hands trembled slightly as he traced the route with one finger, stopping at a point deep in the marked circle. "It's all still here," he said. "The land, the rights. Nobody's touched it because nobody knows the truth. Except us." He told me the story in fuller detail than ever before, how he and my husband had stumbled onto the vein while trying to find a safe path out of the mountains, how they'd sworn to keep it quiet because claiming it then would have meant abandoning the men they were trying to save. "We never went back," he said, "but I kept it in my head all these years. And now, I want it to go to you." I sat back, feeling the weight of his words settle over me. It wasn't just about minerals or money. It was about what that place represented. A turning point in their lives, a debt neither had forgotten. When I left the cabin that afternoon, the map was in my bag again. But this time, it felt heavier, as if it had taken on the gravity of everything James had told me. The sun was low, filtering through the trees in streaks of gold, and for the first time in months, I felt the faint stirrings of hope. Because now, I wasn't just waiting for trouble to find us. I was on its trail. 2 days after I returned from James's cabin, I couldn't stop looking at the map. I'd lay it out on the kitchen table, tracing the red circle over and over until the paper began to soften under my fingertips. The land was real. The rights were real. But if what James said about the minerals was true, then someone, somewhere, must have known, and perhaps chosen to keep it buried. I needed more than a story and an old map. I needed proof. The first step was quiet. I went to the county records office in town, just another older woman in a cardigan with a folder under her arm. I'd been there before for property tax paperwork, so no one looked twice. I asked to see historical land deeds in the northern counties, going back to the 1940s. The clerk, a young man with a polite but distracted manner, fetched a stack of ledgers so heavy they landed on the counter with a thud. Hours passed as I combed through pages, my reading glasses slipping down my nose. And then I found it. An unclaimed parcel of land that matched the location James had described. It had been listed under unknown owner for decades, the taxes marked as non-applicable. That was strange. Stranger still was the note in the margin. Special status. See file clerk before release. When I asked to see the file, the young man's expression shifted just slightly, like a curtain being pulled. "That one's restricted," he said. "You'd need authorization." I left with only my notes, but the seed of suspicion had been planted. If the records were locked up, it meant someone was keeping an eye on that land, and maybe waiting for the right time to take it. That night I called James. He wasn't surprised. "I told you, Martha," he said. "There's more to this than I ever said out loud. Back then, we didn't just stumble onto that vein by accident. There was a survey crew up there, a private one, looking for the same thing. When the mission went bad, they vanished, and no one talked about them again. But I've wondered all these years who might still be holding the key." The next day, I drove out toward Cedar Falls to see Daniel. I didn't tell him the whole story, just enough to let him know I was working on something that could help. But when I mentioned the land, I saw the flicker in his eyes. "Ma, if this is what I think it is, you're stepping into something deep," he said. "People don't sit on property like that without a reason." His words echoed in my mind the whole drive home. It wasn't fear that settled in me, but a kind of resolve. If there was danger in uncovering this truth, so be it. My family had already been living under the shadow of someone else's control. I wasn't about to let that shadow stretch further. That evening, as I was locking up for the night, I found a plain envelope tucked between the screen door and the frame. Inside was a single sheet of paper, no signature, no greeting, just 6 words. "Stop asking questions. It's not yours." I read it twice, then set it down on the counter. My hands didn't shake. If anything, the warning had the opposite effect. It told me I was getting close enough to make someone nervous. I poured myself a cup of tea, sat at the kitchen table with the map spread out once more, and studied the path James had marked. Somewhere up in those mountains lay the truth. About my husband, about James, and about the chance my family needed, and I had no intention of stopping. It was a cold, brittle morning when the call came. The sun hadn't yet climbed over the pines, and I was sitting at the kitchen table with my second cup of coffee, the steam curling up into the dim light. The phone rang, a real ring, not the tinny sound of my cell. And for a moment, I thought it might be Daniel. But it was James. His voice was weaker than I'd ever heard it. "Martha," he said, "we don't have much time. You need to come back up here." I asked what had happened, and he hesitated. I could hear the faint crackle of the wood stove on his end, the shuffle of paper. "Someone's been here," he said finally. "They were asking about you, about the map." I told them nothing, but I don't think they'll stop. "You have to decide. Either we put this in your hands now, or it'll be gone." The line went quiet, except for his labored breathing. My heart pounded. There was no room for delay. I told him I'd leave within the hour. By the time I reached the cabin, the sky had turned a pale gray, the kind that warns of snow. James looked smaller somehow, hunched in his chair, but when he saw me, his eyes sharpened. Without a word, he slid an envelope across the table. Inside were photocopies of documents, old mining surveys, handwritten agreements, even a notarized statement from decades ago with my husband's name on it. "They kept it quiet," James said, "because too many people had a stake in it. But this proves you have a claim. Not just because of me, but because of him." I turned the papers over, my fingers tracing the faded ink. There it was in black and white, my husband's signature alongside James's, a date from the winter of 1953, and a clause that transferred any future rights to the surviving families of the undersigned. My name wasn't on it, but as his widow, it might be enough. Before I could ask more, a sharp knock rattled the cabin door. James froze, and I felt every muscle in my body tense. A man stood outside, mid-50s maybe, dressed in a heavy coat and boots dusted with frost. His face was unfamiliar, but there was a guarded look in his eyes. "Afternoon," he said. his voice polite but edged. "We heard there might be some confusion about a certain piece of land." James didn't invite him in. "No confusion here," he said flatly. "We were just finishing coffee." The man's gaze shifted to me, lingering just a moment too long. "Ma'am," he said with a nod, before turning back to James, "if you do come across anything, maps, papers, you might want to turn them over. Saves everyone a lot of trouble." When he left, the sound of his boots crunching over the frozen ground seemed to echo. James leaned back, exhaling slowly. "You see," he said, "they've been circling, and they'll keep circling until one of us is gone." That night, I stayed at the cabin, sleeping lightly in the spare room. Snow began falling after midnight, tapping against the windows, muting the world outside. In the quiet, I could hear James coughing in the next room, each ragged breath a reminder of how little time he might have left. By morning, we had a plan. I would take the documents, secure them somewhere safe, and begin the process of filing a formal claim. It would be complicated, messy, maybe even dangerous, but it was the only way to make sure the land didn't vanish into someone else's hands. As I drove away, the envelope resting on the seat beside me, I looked once in the rearview mirror. James was standing in the snow, one hand lifted in a slow wave. I had the sinking feeling it might be the last time I saw him. The drive home from James's cabin felt longer than the trip up, the snow coming down in soft, relentless sheets that blurred the road ahead. The envelope sat on the passenger seat, a quiet weight that seemed heavier than paper had any right to be. I kept glancing at it, half afraid it might vanish if I looked away too long. Back in my kitchen, I set the envelope on the table, next to the old brass lamp, and just stared at it. The house was cold. I hadn't left the heat on while I was gone, so I kept my coat on as I made a pot of tea. The steam curled into the still air, carrying the faint scent of chamomile. Outside, the wind rattled the bare branches against the windows, and somewhere in the distance, a dog barked once, and then fell silent. I didn't open the envelope right away. Instead, I walked through the house, making sure each door and window was locked. Maybe it was paranoia, maybe instinct, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone might come looking for what I now had. When I finally sat down and slid the papers out, I spread them across the table just as James had. I read every word, every date, letting the history seep in. The mining survey was detailed, noting the vein's location, its composition, and an estimate of its value at the time. Adjusted for today's market, the numbers were staggering. The notarized agreement, signed by my husband James and the other man in the photograph, was clear enough to give me a fighting chance. But it was the handwritten note, folded among the documents, that stopped me cold. In my husband's familiar, deliberate script, it read, "If you're reading this, it means I didn't get the chance to tell you. This land is worth more than its minerals. It's worth the lives it saved, and the lives it can still save. Protect it, Martha. Protect them." I pressed my fingers to the page, tracing the grooves of his pen strokes like I could feel him through the paper. The ache in my chest was heavy, but underneath it was something steadier. Resolve. Over the next few days, I began making quiet preparations. I scanned the documents, storing copies in a flash drive I tucked inside a flour canister on the pantry's top shelf. I mailed another set to a cousin I trusted in another state, without explanation. I called Daniel and asked about the girls, keeping my voice light, but I could hear the exhaustion in his. "We're hanging on," he said. I wanted to tell him everything, but I knew I needed more certainty before putting this burden on him. Then, one evening, as I was locking the front door, I noticed fresh tire tracks in the thin dusting of snow on the driveway. They weren't mine, and they hadn't been there when I returned from town earlier. The prints led up to the porch and stopped, as if someone had walked right up to the door and stood there. No note this time, no knock. Just silence. That night, I slept with the envelope under my pillow. It sounds foolish, but it gave me a strange comfort, as if I could keep it safe just by being near it. I dreamed of my husband, standing in the doorway of our old bedroom, the morning light spilling in behind him. He didn't say a word, just looked at me in that way he used to when he'd made up his mind about something. When I woke, the decision was made. I couldn't just hold on to the truth. I had to act on it, because if I waited too long, the choice might be taken from me and from my family forever. The morning I decided to act, the sky was pale and brittle, the kind of winter blue that makes the air feel thinner. I brewed a strong pot of coffee, poured it into my husband's old thermos, and packed the documents into a plain manila folder. If things went the way I hoped, this folder would soon be in the hands of someone who could protect it. If they didn't, well, at least it wouldn't be gathering dust in my kitchen. My plan was simple. Drive to the county seat, file a preliminary claim on the land, and get the paperwork officially logged. Once it was in the system, it would be harder for anyone to erase. I wore my heaviest coat, slipped the folder into my bag, and locked the door behind me, listening to the familiar click of the deadbolt. The county building was a squat brick structure with frosted windows and linoleum floors that hadn't been replaced since the 70s. The clerk at the records office was an older woman with hair set in tight curls and a gaze that could slice paper. I explained what I needed, careful to keep my voice steady. When I slid the folder across the counter, she adjusted her glasses and began to flip through the pages. She didn't say much, just the occasional as she examined the documents. Then she looked up. "You know," she said quietly, "this file's going to raise some eyebrows." "I'm counting on it," I replied. She stamped the first form, initialed it, and slid it back to me. "Once this goes into the system, it's public record. Anyone with a reason to care will know by tomorrow morning." That was exactly what I wanted. Visibility. If the claim existed in daylight, it would be harder for shadows to swallow it. I thanked her, tucked the paperwork back into my bag, and stepped out into the cold. I'd barely reached my car when I saw him, the same man who'd come to James's cabin. He was leaning against a black SUV across the street, his hands buried in his coat pockets. When our eyes met, he smiled, not warmly, but like someone who's already decided how the conversation will go. "Mrs. Carter," he called, "you've been busy." I gripped my keys tighter. "Just taking care of family business," I said. "That's what I'm here for, too," he replied, crossing the street with deliberate slowness. "This land, these papers, they're more trouble than they're worth. Why not let them go?" "Because they're mine," I said, surprising myself with the steadiness in my voice. His smile thinned. "Careful, ma'am. Some debts aren't meant to be collected." I didn't answer. I got into my car, started the engine, and pulled away without looking back. My hands were shaking by the time I reached the main road, but I kept driving, the man's words looping in my mind. That night, Daniel called. He sounded tired, but there was something else in his voice. Hope. "Claire got a full-time offer at the clinic again," he said. "We might be able to catch up on some bills." I told him I was glad, though I didn't tell him why my own hope had begun to grow. Not yet. After we hung up, I stood at the kitchen window, looking out over the yard. Snow had started to fall again, coating the old apple tree in white. I thought about James, about the way he'd stood in the snow waving goodbye, and I knew time was running short for him. But the first stone had been set. The claim was filed. And now, no matter what came next, there was a paper trail that would lead back to me. and to the truth. The snow that night fell in slow, deliberate flakes, drifting past the porch light like ash from a long burning fire. I sat in my armchair by the window, a knitted shawl around my shoulders, watching the yard disappear under a fresh white blanket. The house was quiet, except for the faint ticking of the wall clock and the occasional pop from the wood stove. On the table beside me was the photograph I'd taken from the cedar chest, a black and white image of my husband, James, and the third man, whose name I'd never known. They stood shoulder to shoulder, their expressions serious, the kind of look young men wear when they've seen too much too soon. I traced the edge of the photo with my thumb, wondering again what stories were buried in those mountains, and how many had died with the men who'd lived them. Earlier that afternoon, I'd made a pot of chicken soup, though I wasn't much hungry. Old habits die hard, and in my family, cooking was as much about comfort as it was about eating. The kitchen still smelled faintly of thyme and garlic, the scent lingering in the air like a memory you can't quite place. I reached for the letter from my husband, the one tucked among James's papers. I'd read it a dozen times in the past week, but tonight the words seemed to hold more weight. Protect it, Martha. Protect them. The them was my family, of course, but in that quiet moment I realized it might also have meant something bigger, an idea, a promise, maybe even a piece of himself he'd wanted to pass on. The tea in my cup had gone cold, but I kept holding it, letting the porcelain warm my palms. Outside the wind picked up, sweeping loose snow into swirls that danced briefly in the light, before vanishing into the dark. I thought about calling Daniel, just to hear his voice, but I didn't. Instead, I imagined the girls asleep in their beds, their breathing even and steady, unaware of the undercurrents pulling at the edges of their family's story. I wondered if they'd ever know the lengths I was going to now, if they'd understand that love sometimes looks like keeping secrets until it's safe to share them. The night grew deeper, and the silence of the house settled around me. I closed my eyes for a moment, listening. Not for danger, not for knocks on the door, but for the sound of my own heart, steady and sure. Somewhere upstairs, a floorboard creaked, probably just the old wood adjusting to the cold. Still, I glanced toward the staircase, half expecting to see a shadow that didn't belong. But there was nothing, only the familiar darkness of the hallway. I picked up my knitting, the soft click of the needles filling the space between thoughts. Row after row, stitch after stitch, the pattern grew beneath my hands. It was something I'd started for Emma months ago, a deep blue scarf, the color of the winter sky just before dusk. When I finally set it aside, I leaned back in the chair and let my eyes wander to the snow-covered yard, glowing faintly under the moonlight. For the first time in weeks, I felt something like stillness, not safety exactly, but a moment to breathe. Tomorrow would bring whatever it brought. Tonight, I would let the quiet have me. The days after filing the claim passed in a strange kind of calm, though it was the kind that feels like the air before a thunderstorm, still, heavy, waiting. Each morning I woke to the familiar creak of the floorboards, the smell of coffee drifting from the kitchen, the sound of the wind nudging against the siding. On the surface nothing had changed, but underneath, everything had. Daniel called more often now, just to check in. He never asked directly about the paperwork. I hadn't told him the full scope, but I could sense he knew I was working on something important. There was a little more light in his voice, a little less of the defeated tone I'd heard for months. That was enough to keep me going. Then one afternoon, as I was sweeping the porch, I saw a familiar figure coming up the drive. It was the same man from James's cabin and the county building. This time, though, his coat was unbuttoned, and he carried no pretense of a polite smile. "Afternoon, Mrs. Carter," he said, his boots grinding against the frozen gravel. "You've been busy." "I have," I replied, leaning the broom against the porch rail. "And I don't recall inviting you." He chuckled, but there was no humor in it. "You've got something that belongs to a lot of people, not just you. There's still time to step away before this gets complicated." I met his gaze, steady. "This land, these papers, they've been in my family's shadow for 70 years. If someone wanted them, they should have come for them back when the men who earned them were still alive." His eyes narrowed just slightly before he turned and walked back to his SUV. The sound of the engine faded down the road, but I knew I hadn't seen the last of him. That night, I sat at the kitchen table with the map and documents spread out again. I thought about James, about the way his voice had sounded on the phone. Thin, but certain. I thought about my husband's letter, about the quiet directive it carried, and I thought about the girls growing up in a world that had no idea about the history buried in those mountains. 2 days later, the phone rang. It was James's son, a man I'd never met. His voice was formal, almost hesitant. "Mrs. Carter, I thought you should know. Dad passed this morning." For a moment, the room seemed to tilt, my hand tightening around the receiver. Was it peaceful?" "Yes," the son said softly. "He spoke of you, said to tell you the debt was settled." I thanked him, though the words felt small against the weight of the moment. After we hung up, I sat at the table for a long time, my eyes fixed on nothing. James had carried this secret for decades, and in the end, he'd trusted me to see it through. The next morning, I drove back to the county building, this time to meet with a lawyer recommended by one of the clerks. She was young, sharp-eyed, and efficient. When I laid the documents in front of her, she read them carefully, nodding now and then. "You've got a case," she said finally. "It won't be easy, and it won't be quick. But if you're willing to fight, you could secure this land for your family." "I've been fighting for them my whole life," I said. "This is just another round." When I left her office, the winter sun was low in the sky, casting long shadows across the courthouse steps. I stood there for a moment, letting the cold bite at my cheeks, and felt the quiet certainty settle in me again. Whatever storm was coming, I was ready to face it. I've often thought that time has a way of revealing the true shape of things, not in the rush of the moment, but in the long, slow unfolding. Now, with the claim filed, James gone, and the first steps taken toward securing the land, I could see how all the pieces fit together. What had started as a strange letter in the mail had become a lifeline, not just for my son and granddaughters, but for me. Some mornings, I still wake expecting to hear my husband moving about the kitchen, the clink of his coffee cup on the counter, the shuffle of his boots by the door. I don't think that longing ever really leaves you. But lately, when I picture him, I see him standing in those mountains with James, the wind cutting cold across their faces, both of them knowing they were making choices that would ripple forward through time. This land, this claim, it was never just about money. It was about a promise. James had kept his word. My husband had trusted me to do the same. And now, I would see it through to the end. The man in the black SUV hasn't been back, though I don't fool myself into thinking he's gone for good. There will be more visits, more veiled warnings, maybe even outright threats. But the fear that used to sit heavy in my chest has changed shape. It's still there, but now it shares space with something stronger. Purpose. I've started writing everything down in a ledger. The dates, the calls, the visits, the details James told me. If anything happens to me, Daniel will have a clear trail to follow. I've tucked a copy of the documents into the ledger's back cover, along with my husband's letter. One day, when the girls are old enough to understand, I'll tell them the full story, not just of the land, but of the men who fought to protect it, and of the friendship that spanned decades and outlasted war. Some evenings I sit on the porch and watch the sun drop behind the ridge, the sky going gold and then deepening to purple. The quiet is different now. It's not the empty kind that used to ache. It's the quiet of knowing I've stepped into the role I was meant to play, even if it took nearly 8 decades to get here. I know there will come a day when my part in this story ends, whether the claim succeeds or not. But when that day comes, I want to meet it with the certainty that I didn't turn away, that I stood where I was needed, that I kept my promise. And if there's one truth I've learned, it's this. Family is not only who you're born to, but who you choose to fight for. Sometimes, love is steady and gentle. Other times, it's fierce enough to stand against the wind. I'll keep standing. For Daniel, for Lily and Emma, for the man I loved and the friend who carried him through the mountains, for the promise that still binds us all together. And that's where her journey leaves us, still feeling the echo of her choices, her love, and her quiet strength. I'd love to know where you're watching from, and if her story brought back a memory of your own. In our next video, we'll share another true story of a grandmother whose past held a secret worth protecting for a lifetime.